Okay, so a flaw of mine is that I don't have a whole lot of patience. So um, I guess patience might be the right word. So this subject matter, um, I guess I'm just kind of making an excuse for myself at the beginning. I do wish that I took the time to type up notes, have it all organized, lay out my position, um, as opposed to just feeling a little bit frustrated at the need to say my opinions and just get them out in a less than ideal way. Maybe not making my position as strongly as I could if I took the time to do video editing, preparing, and whatnot. But this is something I do want to talk about, and if I fail in some way to explain myself as clearly as I would like, as effectively as I would like, maybe I'll make more videos on this. So I watched a video called My Problem with Sam Harris's Morality, and it's CosmicSkeptic. I recently discovered his channel, which really smart guy. He was, I guess, making these videos since he was a teenager, like in high school. He was like, I don't know, 17, 18. Obviously has read tons of books, really intelligent guy. And what I find interesting about this still, kind of like relating to my last video in a way, well, a lot of this will relate because it's talking about morality and subjectivity and objectivity, but also I found it fascinating how you can have people, once again, where you're like, wow, they're just so intelligent, so well-read, so able to see, but they can still have certain blind spots in their arguments and not see, at least in the sense of where you go off the rails philosophically into a place of just so impractical that you almost, they seem to forget the practical application of the subject matter that they're discussing to begin with. Not that I think it's always wrong to just have talks about ideas that maybe don't have directly obvious practical application, but particularly when you're talking about morality, my assumption would be it does eventually lead back to a place of how does this actually impact how we see things. And I think they would agree with that too, because they even talk about in the beginning of the video, Rationality rules. He talks about how wow, this could change everything if Sam Harris is right. And Rationality rules thinks Sam Harris is right, that morality is objective. And CosmicSkeptic is saying no, he believes that he's still unconvinced. And what I guess the part that I found frustrating is, even though I do think morality is subjective, CosmicSkeptic, being as smart as he is, his arguments against Rationality rules weren't very strong. Not because I don't think there are strong arguments for morality being subjective, I just don't think he was making them, and I think he was also caving too easily to sort of false analogies. The main one being Rationality rules was trying to compare the way we see medicine as being objectively, sort of an objective practice, like in the sense that we can agree that certain things are objectively good or bad for your health, which even that, I think we could put some question into it, right? So like I was even thinking, like, an example he gave is like, oh, we know smoking is bad for your health, right? Which even that, there's an element of subjectivity there in the sense that smoking is bad in the sense that it is more likely to cause X, Y, and Z problems, but we could also even say, well, smoking reduces this person's anxiety, and this is how a reduction in anxiety affects this aspect of health. And then in certain ways you could argue that it's immeasurable, or that you do have to prioritize which aspects of health do you value the most. Do you value most not having cancer, or do you value most not having, I don't know, some other thing that would be a byproduct of lowered levels of anxiety. Now, that's not necessarily my main issue with the video, but yeah, that whole thing was a big part of this video in particular, this idea that, well, if we treat medicine as having at least objective components, because we can agree that health is a good thing, and health is about, when you're trying to aim for health, being healthy, we know what that's talking about. They said, well, with morality, there's this assumption that morality is based in well-being, and CosmicSkeptic is saying, well, I don't know that that's objective truth. That's more of a definition, a semantics issue, and that's where it gets to be absurd. It's like, one, what does well-being even mean? And even if, we at the same time that I'm saying that, yes, we can sort of let's just whatever grant him that premise. Instead, he spends the whole video arguing with him about the premise on whether or not we can say that morality is based on well-being, if that's what it means. Almost like they're arguing, in a sense, dictionary definitions as opposed to the practical application of these sort of debates. Why would someone want to argue that morality is objective? What is the actual point they're making beyond some sort of philosophical, like, being a show-off in a sense, right? I mean, which I would argue a lot of it does come down to that, but let's just put that aside for now. What is the actual point of trying to say that morality is objective? What is the point ultimately being proven? And I would say the point is that you're trying to say that you can actually come up with some degree of, even if you were to argue like Sam Harris does, that he's not claiming that. He's claiming that, yes, morality is objective, but he would admit that maybe he doesn't know, that he doesn't have all the evidence. The evidence isn't all in yet as far as every single moral issue, what the objective right decision would be, that it can be found. So I'm gonna go to my notes a little bit just to make sure that I'm covering all the things I wanted to talk about. So one thing is, if morality is objective, who is the arbitrator of this? Who do we go to? Is it Sam Harris? Is it some guy on YouTube? Who does have this? And how does science provide this? Now, the one thing that, they don't talk about in this video in particular, now these two guys did debate this subject further, and I haven't watched all their other videos talking about, CosmicSkeptic's made other videos about morality and even had him back on to discuss it further. I could watch more to see if they've updated. I think maybe they've changed their positions in some ways. I'm not sure, but what they don't address in this video, at least, is what is the assumption? Like, even with Sam Harris, like, so you'd have to agree with some sort of utilitarian view that the moral objectivity is about what is to the greatest good to the greatest number of people, sort of thing, because it's just obvious in such a very quickly observable way to anyone that what is good for one person isn't always what's good for the whole. So is morality about what's best for the well-being of the self, the immediate family, the tribe, the community, the state, the country, humanity as a whole? And then that's when it's obvious that can Sam Harris, CosmicSkeptic, Rationality Rules, can any of them convince me which I should value? Should I put to what degree even, should I put my family above my community or my country above humanity? There is a certain hierarchy there in terms of what we're going to value. And maybe some people out there just say, they would argue, the ultimate good is what's best for humanity, and that's just what that would be a completely subjective thing. How can you objectively convince me? Can you use facts to why I ought to care about humanity before I care about myself or my family or my tribe? How it gets closer to being about me and those I'm closest to and care most about. So it's a huge element they don't really discuss. It's like, even if, which I already don't agree with for many reasons I'll try to get into here, that it could be objective. We agree it's about well-being, and then you can there's maybe ways you could measure things out in terms of what's the great. Yeah, there are obvious situations where something can work out for an individual that does not work out for the group. And in fact, I would argue that's what happens, that's what morality is about all the time. That's the inherent nature of why morality is such an issue to begin with, why the subjectivity is so significant, is because it's always about conflicting wants and desires. It's always about conflicting desires and what I want versus what someone else wants. I mean that's the whole issue. Like, is that people do gain from the suffering of others, even if it's just as simple as, you know, talking about, you know, if we were used to use eating meat as an example, and we just let's not get too. I won't get too deep into that as an example right now, but let's just say, just go with me to say that you could be just as healthy with or without meat. You know, I don't want to get. I'm not an expert on this, but let's just say we could go with that premise, right? And so that it was only about, you know, you ate meat because it tasted good, you know. So that's, so you would suffer in some sense. If you cut out meat, because you would crave it and you would miss eating it, and you would lose out on eating it with friends at restaurants and so on, and then that goes in conflict with what happens to the animal, the suffering the animal experiences, for then you to get that reward. But that goes for things outside of animals. Obviously, everything we do as humans, as far as what we how we spend our time, resources, when we're gaining in some way, we could always make the argument that someone else is, you know, other people are gaining when we gain, and other people are losing. It's a very complicated thing, and a lot of factors go into it. And even if you argue in some way, well, if we still had all scientific knowledge, we could still break it down in some way. One, we are so far away from being able to do that for it to have any relevancy. But even if we put relevancy aside, you still wouldn't be able to prove ultimately what I should value in terms of my own pleasure, my own lack of suffering compared to others. You know, to what degree should I value myself over others? And like I said, including myself as maybe even extending that to family, tribe, community, and so on. So, you know, yeah, it's like you could even argue like the serial killer is suffering when he chooses not to kill, right? So should he kill because to relieve his suffering because he has this desire that he wants to quell? You know, it's obviously I would argue yes, don't kill, right? I would tell the serial killer not to do it, but it's, you know, even if we look at things more specifically, like we could look at age of consent, right? So is someone a terrible, awful person when they have sex with someone who's 17 years old and 364 days, and then that next day though they're okay? You know, at one point did they deserve jail for life, and the next day they deserve 0 jail time, right? So that's a very specific example, but this applies to all sorts of things. Is theft wrong? Okay. If your child is dying of starvation, would you steal a piece of bread from a billionaire? Why not? Or why? Right? So now, you know, what Sam Harris or even, you know, Rationality Rules might argue is they might say, well, sure, maybe there is some degree of subjectivity there, but ultimately there's still some things that are objective, right? So that it would be objectively wrong to just punch a kid in the face because you think it's funny or something, right? But even so, it still all boils down to a sense of appealing to someone's preference as to what suffering they take more seriously and value more, right? So obviously the kind of person who would, you know, we could just, we'll just say in theory, someone who would want to go around punching kids in the face is maybe in their mind they're deriving some pleasure from it, right? And you know, they're convinced that it's worth it. Let's just say this person is convinced it's worth it. The enjoyment they get out of it is worth whatever consequences they face. Now, I might say, oh, well, it's obvious to me, you know, whatever laughs you're getting from doing that is not worth the horrible damage you're doing to other people. But still, it comes down to sort of appealing to what someone should care about and take more seriously. And I'm going to take more seriously the pain that the child is suffering from getting hit in the face than the pain someone feels because you know, that their craving of violence was not met. Now, even if though, what if we put we try to use science and we put the brains under some sort of scientific observation, and we're able to see that this person, there was just no way that they could feel emotionally okay without punching kids in the face, that there was just no alternative. and that the degree that they were suffering actually on some measurable scale that we came up with was actually greater than the pain the child faces by getting hit. Would I then just suddenly cave to science in this way and say, all right, I guess science has proven the facts. Punch away, you know. This is a very bizarre hypothetical example, but I do think it still serves as a way to show that it always comes down to a subjective preference in what we take more seriously, what we care about more, and doesn't have to do with, it's not going to have to do with science. And even if science does present something that looks like it's objective, why ought I value that over my own sort of instinctual feeling about things? Should I ignore my instincts if Sam Harris comes up with a very convoluted scientific way to show me to completely change my values in a way that no matter how much he proves it in a sense, I still feel like, yeah, you know what? Sam Harris is advocating for something that just doesn't feel right, no matter how much data he presents that is supposed to convince me. The other thing is, now I'm not going to say that people shouldn't talk about things just because potentially, the wrong person, someone who, like I said before, you can be sort of intelligent but then ignorant in a certain way, and then you can take intelligent people can come up with sort of bad ideas, or maybe they are good ideas, but if you don't think through them enough, it ends up actually resulting into a sort of bad idea. Like, people can take great great works of philosophers and then use it as justification for genocide, which might be in total opposition to what the philosopher actually intended by their work, or if you kind of read it more fully, that you would understand that was not what they were advocating. But I do think that is the case with some of these things, is like, you sometimes wonder, not that I think, ultimately, I wouldn't think that Sam Harris wouldn't advocate some, I don't know the details of all of Sam Harris's personal views, as far as his politics and whatnot, but, you almost wonder if you go too far down this rabbit hole, if you can come to sort of ridiculous conclusions. That's, you start with one, it could be a highly intelligent person, but you start with one little faulty premise, and the next thing you know, you've come to this conclusion you're just super convinced of, which is important, I guess, why it's important to remain doubtful, and that's why I think actually inherently the subjectivity of morality being recognized is important in itself. Now, the reason why people like Sam Harris, and even CosmicSkeptic even says he would like morality to be objective, even though he doesn't believe it's so, is because of the disgust at sort of these leftist moral relativists who, once they, break free from religion, they're like, and I've talked about this before. I experienced this in college, where there were leftists who were defending certain Muslims stoning women to death for being raped. They were saying, well, it's culturally relative. If they think the woman should be stoned to death for being raped, who am I to judge, right? In which I went back the next day of class and had a whole typed up thing to express my disgust at the hypocritical and idiotic and just immoral nature of this sort of argument. But so that there is that instinct to want to have to say, yeah, morality isn't relative. And you can, like what I originally said, one, we have empathy, and that can be enough sometimes. Oh, I give a shit about the suffering of people. If I see some sort of egregious suffering, I'm going to want to stop it. And yes, I value some suffering over others. I can sort of, even though it's subjective, whatever, that doesn't lessen the degree to which I'm willing to take action, right? So, that's the kind of ridiculous thing here, too, is like they'll talk about, they'll say, well, if morality is subjective, how can I tell someone that they shouldn't, how come in this Muslim nation where women are being so terribly oppressed over here, how can I tell them it's wrong if morality is subjective? It's like, first of all, people already do that anyway, regardless of their view, or even if they've even considered if morality is subjective or objective, people do call it wrong, whether it's religious people or atheists. And we don't have to appeal to objectivity. Not everyone is with you on the premise that the only things that can really be stood up for in a very strong way have to be quote unquote objective. I mean, the real thing too is once you break it down, you start asking yourself, what does it even mean to say objective? Which ultimately I do think it gets to a place that's almost like the implication is just saying, this thing is inarguable. This is fact. We have made this written in stone and it can no longer be questioned. I mean, I agree with the importance of that in the sense that I do think questioning some things can ultimately be a sort of waste of time. Like, I don't think most of us really feel the need to debate whether child abuse is okay or not. We can just be like, yeah, that's shit, you know. Now, if you want to look into literature and science and talk to child abuse victims and so on, go for it. But 99.999% of us really, we feel comfortable with the fact that child abuse is wrong. We don't really feel like it needs to be analyzed so deeply to know whether or not we should condemn someone who is raping and punching their kid in the face or whatever. So when they get into these philosophical debates, they sometimes seem to forget this. It's like, you don't need morality to be objective, to be passionately against something. And it's almost like concerning to me in a way that they feel that they can't see this, or that they feel like that, and that's what I said before in that last video about Molyneux debating about free will. It's like people feel like as soon as they give in into acknowledging that morality is subjective, that they then have to then concede some sort of caring less about their values and preferences. Whereas what I'm saying is, I could say, you could find one person who says rape is objectively wrong, and I could say, well, technically rape is subjectively wrong. But you still could have the person who says rape is objectively wrong do nothing about it in any practical way, and I might say rape is subjectively wrong, and I might go on a killing spree of killing all rapists or something, right? I mean, theoretically. So you see what I'm saying? It's like the identifying something as objective or subjective doesn't necessarily have to lead to it doesn't necessarily have to imply what sort of action is taken. And that's why my ultimate point here is that really morality, when we talk about what's good and bad, has to do with what we want to see the world look like, what we prefer, what actions we want to encourage or stamp out. And so much of it has to do with, yes, empathy, but also consequences, that we will and there will be consequences for actions that we dislike. And this idea that we need science or even God to sort of figure out that certain things are disgusting to us, I think is a false idea. I think, yes, it can lead to some interesting discussions. We might, through discussion, rethink certain things that we previously thought were disgusting. We might say, oh, that's not quite as disgusting as I thought, whatever. But I don't think we need to just completely flip over the table and act like we're just so confused about the very basics. Anything that even we could even religious people have to agree that even if they think morality is given by God objectively, you're going to have to agree, I would think, that there's still the subjective interpretation of the commandments, for example, or which commandment is more significant than the other. Now, maybe there is. I don't know enough to know if maybe in the Bible there is a list of which ones matter more, but we know the idea that oftentimes that there would be conflicting commandments. There would be times that to defend or live according to one commandment, you would have to break another. So which one do you value more? And does this commandment mean that you always act this way, even if it means going against God in this other way? So you see what I mean? So that applies to religion, but it also applies to atheists or a sort of secular moral system. So the only thing that you could even argue around that is that, okay, fine, there has to be some degree of subjectivity here, but some things are just objectively morally wrong, right? But those things are things that we've kind of already agreed on anyway, at least most of us. I mean, at least most of us that are even willing to engage in this sort of rational discussion to begin with, I would think, the idea that rape, murder, child abuse, the sort of obvious things that you could even try to or would want to say is just objective, we kind of already agree anyway, at least in principle, at least in practical, in a practical sense. So the conversation, in some sense, is just sort of, it's a couple things. One, you could argue it's sort of a waste of time, although I would say it's not completely, in the sense that I find it to be interesting, right? So it's like, I think, you could argue that watching comedy is a waste of time, because what is that producing? Where is the productivity? Now, of course, you could argue that it's producing this, not the other, or that intellectual discussion produces your ability to think critically and so on. But I'm just saying, even if it doesn't have an obvious, very direct, practical end goal, or at least if it's just, even if it's just sort of, not so obviously practical, entertainment is entertainment. And so in some sense, these philosophical discussions, I feel like, serve more as entertainment like porn would or something, than any sort of reason to change one's moral framework. But the other argument, though, is that even though I think that's true, some people do get convinced by these things. And some people, Sam Harris, I'm not so, like I said, I'm not so familiar on where he leads as far as what his moral proposals are on a lot of things, but some people might be convinced enough that they sort of do end up looking to Sam Harris as some sort of moral authority. And that if Sam Harris then says, well, these wars are good, and these wars are bad, and the age of consent should be 17 and a half, or 19, or 15, that sort of, that he would have the answers, right? There is the danger in that. Now, I'm not saying necessarily with Sam Harris specifically, but ultimately, where does this all lead? In that, if morality was objective, we would start looking to the experts. Who are the experts, and why should we trust them? When really, I don't think that's necessary. At least not for the basic things that we already sort of do agree on. Now, it is true that as time goes on, what society deems as acceptable changes, because there are certain things that aren't thought out enough about. People aren't standing up for certain things, like we could argue maybe animal rights. Even aside from the meat industry, animal testing still exists, and so on. And so maybe people that advocate for that can change that, whereas maybe 20, 30 years from now, maybe 50% of the population will be vegetarian, or maybe animal testing will become even less common, and so on. But that's going to be based on appeals to emotion, people having that sort of put in people's face more, intellectual arguments that intellectual arguments could be part of it too, but I don't think it's based on objectivity versus subjectivity. I think these get into sort of semantics issues that people generally aren't going to care that much or be moved to take action by. And if they are, I think that actually does have the potential to lead to a dangerous place at times, when people might start getting convinced to act totally against just sort of their natural intuition and inclination, which, like I said, I would hope would be about empathy. If you're someone who doesn't have much empathy or doesn't have empathy at all, there isn't probably really, without brainwashing someone maybe to fear hell and things like that, a sort of religious perspective, someone that has no empathy really doesn't have the incentive to be a good person at all, aside from the consequences that they'll face by doing things that society deems as bad. So, anyway, there's probably a lot more that I have on this, but I think that'll be enough for this video.